Shinyelu. Uh, I have been a part of the Kheprw community for my entire life. Um, I have done a lot of different stuff like in the space, throughout that time, but most of my work now is centered in digital storytelling and like communications work. I am Kheprw's representative in the Communicating Our Power fellowship with like the CJA.
What's he
And the Climate Justice Alliance, and that is a network of organizations that we are a part of that is centered around uh, supporting frontline communities facing climate change. Um, and I just do whatever else they ask me to, and that is part of the reason I'm here today. Yeah, I'll pass it to Alvin.
All right, is there a check-in question for today?
Oh, yeah. Do we want to do our like number, color, and then um I'm trying to think of like a housing related question that isn't too invasive. Maybe like I don't know, maybe like for our check-in question we can just like share some of like our experiences with and like maybe even just like places where we've observed like housing discrimination and housing inequality, even in like our own lives. And I guess since I'm here, I'll start. I am a uh, I am a green 7 today. And the last apartment that I actually lived in was really bad. Um, Aside from like, the maintenance and everything, just overall being like not that great. There was like frequently like the unhoused people from like in the neighborhood would find their ways into the building, especially during like the colder months to like sleep there during the night. And I think like the it was like in a predominantly like black and like brown neighborhood. It's like south of 38th Street. Like it was like just south of 38th Street. And which is kind of like a big like a visible divider in terms of like, wealth and access, just like here in the city. And so yeah, it was just like a very stark like situation in which like um I don't know, people's needs clearly weren't being met. The needs of the tenants were not being met. The needs of the other people in the community were clearly not being met. And nobody who had like the power and like resources invested in the community seemed to care at all. So um, I'll pass it to Alvin, and then we can go back
Hey,
around.
everybody. I'm feeling like an 8 turquoise today. And probably the story that sticks out to me the most is um, one of the neighbors over at one of Kheprw's campus who was a young person who's in Kheprw's program. Like their family got their house foreclosed on kind of under the community's nose. Like no one knew about it, that they were struggling. And then that house was sold for like $25,000, like cash to like a house flipper. And just recently we were able to acquire it back. But again, like at a giant markup of like over $200,000. So just kind of seeing that cycle of how people who like the wealth is extracted, like the idea of home ownership can sometimes be an illusion around wealth building, that just people who like don't have or are afraid to ask for help from like their neighbors and community just like lead to basically wealth extraction, whether it's like investors and gentrification and flippers. But I guess the story is trying to find our way to reclaim it back, gain control back of our neighborhood. It's actually a positive story. I'll pass to Ray's on.
Good morning. I am. It's Sky Blue 8. As far as discrimination I've seen in the neighborhood, my grandmother used to live. Well, her old home was on near the Children's Museum, and that just road itself was already a narrow road. Driving through it, you would either be dodging other people's cars or the massive potholes that was just on the street itself. A lot of homes were owned by a lot of like elderly people who've lived there throughout their lives. Beat up homes, not the best of looking. The ones who might look better or some of the outer homes on the road turning into it. So deeper into the neighborhood, you'll have homes that lawns are maybe messed up, huge yards that have been unkempt for no matter how many years, but it's your grandparents. You're not gonna not go see them. You're not gonna not show them love. And the neighborhood didn't start getting better until I want to say recently. And my grandmother moved out. She could no longer take care of the home because she began to well, she grew older, so she couldn't live by herself anymore. We had to put her in a home for self-living care because Alzheimer's. She started to her stages of Alzheimer's, and after just losing that home, it was a heavy memory in my life. But just seeing how it looked, I didn't want her to live in there anymore. It's staying looking at this house that I grew up in, being so beat down, and knowing that my grandmother was living there for no matter how many years she lived there without anybody saying anything or just being there to help her. And she, of course, didn't say anything or speak up because she's elderly, she's used to it. We're supposed to say
Pass the, number, color, did you do that already? And you pass it.
You got that to me? Okay. All right, I'm LaShonda. I am a green 8 today. I can speak on a situation that actually happened to me. And it was, I normally went into this situation knowing that it was a predatory act. Shortly after, I was born and raised in Gary, Indiana, but I moved to Minnesota to raise my family. And to get my kids into a better school district, I opted to live in housing that wasn't the greatest. It was on the outside of an affluent neighborhood, so I knew the landlord, from what my understanding was, pretty much a slum landlord. But I chose that to give my kids a better education. And what I experienced was, when we first moved in, had enough bedrooms. The house was decent enough, but we had to do all the cleaning. I didn't get any break on the rent or the deposit. And every month, my landlord, and we were the only Black tenants there, showed up at my door to collect the rent. Where the other tenants, however they paid their rent, direct deposit or withdraw from their bank account, that's how they paid theirs. But he showed up every month to collect my rent. So I knew what I was under, but I wanted my kids to experience a better education. Now that I think back, that some of my kids, it was 3 kids, got a good education. But my boys, I have 2 boys and a girl. My boys experienced something totally different in that neighborhood, going through that school system. So I look back and I'm like, everything that I think is better may not be better. So I think we probably would be better off not so much in what they call the ghetto, but in between there somewhere, instead of trying to get into that particular school system. But that's my discrimination story. And I will pass it to Amy.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing that.
Yeah.
I would say something that's on my mind is the way that, and I mean, really, LaShonda kind of alluded to this with her story, is like the way that reproductive justice intersects with housing. When I was a kid, my mom was a single mom, and so she owned the house that we lived in. Now, this was the 90s, and it was Irvington. So she owned this little house that we lived in right next to the railroad over there. And it flooded one year, and that was a big deal. I mean, it was, the house had to be jacked up, and it was scary. I think it's when you're a child of a single parent, it can just, you feel that weight of like, if something goes wrong, like it's a big deal, and even as a kid, you kind of know that. And then, so housing, it was kind of like, anything could go any kind of way if something happens to my mother. And then when I was like 32, I ended up getting divorced myself. And that put me in a situation where I was working part-time. So it was really hard to qualify for renting somewhere, because I was taking care of my daughter, who was 3 at the time. So I was doing this unpaid labor, and you can't put that on a rental application. And so that was really tough. And it was also like, I had owned my house with my husband on the Near East Side, and it appreciated in value so much over the 2 years that we lived there, that there was no chance that I could buy out his equity in the house. So that meant I had to go. And so my daughter and I were we didn't have anywhere to go. I mean, we stayed with friends, actually my friend's parents. We stayed with my friend's parents until I could get a full-time job. So I'm really interested in, and therefore qualify for to be able to rent somewhere, right? So I'm interested in the way that reproductive justice and parenting kind of intersects with housing, particularly. Oh, my color. I choose pink and the number 2. And I will pass to Erica.
Hi, my name is Erica. I am like an Aqua 8 today. I think in what we're seeing a lot of over at our housing center is all the traditional rental issues that we have in the state of Indiana because of the lack of tenant protections. But we're also seeing this, I think, Alvin, you kind of mentioned it with gentrification, this wanting of pushing long-term homeowners out of their properties for little money and then flipping them for selling it really large. And I think what we're kind of isn't a huge talked about story is these people who've lived in their homes for years and years and years, decades, and as they get older, it can be hard to maintain those properties. And so what people allege anyway is that people get calls to buy their homes, they say no, and then all of a sudden they've been reported to the health department for a code violation or something like that. And so I think that's very common in some of our around the city center neighborhoods. And it's something that doesn't get brought up that much. And it's also very difficult to track down and to investigate. But there are organizations out there trying to help keep those people in their homes. NeighborLink is one of them, which is an amazing organization that will help people with health violations. But anyway, those are some of the things that we're seeing, or I'm seeing, that aren't often talked about.
Thanks, Erica. Wahid, I think you're up.
Oh, sorry, y'all. I was having some difficulties just now. So my name's Wahid. I am a yellow 7 right now. I think I missed the check-in question. Got a vibe, but can somebody like tell me what the question was?
Yeah, basically we're just kind of like going around and sharing some of our own like experiences and observations in the real world with like housing discrimination and housing injustice.
Yeah, man. Whew, how much time I got? I mean, I think it's difficult just like being a black renter in general. Um, and just knowing that like apartments that I knew that I qualified for are not getting it. And I remember one specific time I was living in Boston and my then girlfriend and I, my wife now, went to check out a place. And there were two white college students, two young women, and their mom checking out the same apartment. And the landlord only spoke to the white young women that were there, like wouldn't even like we had to like fight for attention. And it was clear like the questions I was asking, like I was an experienced renter, right? I graduated school. Um, and it was so funny, like one of the students was like, oh, we should just be asking all the questions he's asking, right? So like despite like me like having a rental history, like having experience being um having a job, right? Like being out in the world, they were still prioritized over me. So it's just, it was I think I was 24 at the time, so it was like just a healthy reminder of like what's gonna the challenges that come. And then I'm from Oakland, California, and my family was gentrified out of San Francisco because my grandparents weren't able to buy a house in San Francisco in the 80s. um, excuse me, San Francisco's black neighborhoods were like gentrified rapidly and pretty early on in the gentrification landscape. And so, I don't know, I'm a child of gentrification before we really had the language to describe what that was. So,
I just want to quickly point out that all of these things should be reported to your local fair housing center, and we can move on.
I think that's everyone's check-in. So let's start off the book discussion by first I want to ask like, just like show of hands, who here has actually, ever read this book? Or at the very least like started it. Okay.
Half the book.
Half the book. I like have like I'm just like kind of just like through the first chapter myself. Um uh but okay, cool. So I guess like let's start then by I don't know. I guess like okay, here's a guiding question. Um for those of you that have read the book, there'll be one version and then the rest of us we can kind of like think about it a different way. But um reading what you've read, you know, um basically it's about these interactions between these different organizations, right? And how like the government and like contractors and like local organizations like have conspired through history to prevent access to housing for certain people. So I guess like what are some ways today that we see that is happening or that has happened and that like the effects of those relationships, like ways that those like the actions and the conditions that they like produce have been like replicated over the years. Like let's start there. Does that make sense?
Can you state your question more
Yeah, yeah,
succinctly?
yeah, 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 yeah. So knowing that these different organizations work together to do the things that they do, um, maybe let's talk about examples that we see in the present day or ways that some of the examples that were mentioned in the book, how like their actions affect our present day like circumstances, or just like examples that weren't mentioned in the book.
Well, banks are still redlining people today, so there's that. There's no nice way of putting that, really.
Mhm.
We have several cases that have been settled. We see it, we have reports on it, it's still happening. Bank branches are pulling out of neighborhoods of color, lower income neighborhoods at greater rates than white suburbs. The mortgage denial rates are higher for people of color and lower income individuals. That still exists today.
Yeah. No, I think that there's also like, you know, because obviously the banks are responsible, as the ones like actually like, executing these policies, putting them into action. But that is supposed to be a crime, and yet there is no accountability, there are no consequences, you know? So I think that there's also definitely a big question there about like, even if it's not written into law that, this is what we do, even if there are laws saying that this is illegal, there's still like no enforcement, when it still happens. So
Well,
Well,
sorry, go Alan.
go ahead, Erica. You can
The
ask.
Fair Housing Center can enforce that if we
Mhm.
can get all of the information we need, but I think the problem with discrimination nowadays is there's not necessarily a sign saying, whites here, blacks here. It's under the surface, and it's
Mhm.
on the burden of the person being discriminated against to know their rights, see the signs, report it, and do
Mhm.
all of that within the timeline necessary of filing a complaint. And then that process takes time. And this is housing, it's a basic human need. It's not like you can wait a year and a half for it to be settled and wait for that unit. You'd then have to move on to different housing and just hope that somehow you get compensated after the fact. And so that's just like an extremely frustrating part of the process. It would be so amazing if there was a way to like preempt it ahead of time somehow. I don't know what that would look like, but
When you
right now we
say
just don't have the tools for that.
when you say preempted, can you talk a little bit about what you mean there?
I mean, instead of waiting until it happens and then making the person who has been discriminated against have to do something about it,
Prevent the
they're
discrimination.
prevent it to
Mhm.
begin with, which
Yeah.
I mean, technically filing lawsuits, making banks pay huge amounts of money for redlining cases is supposed to then discourage it in the future. But we can only do so many cases at a time, and we're only one organization, and every state has just a few.
Mhm.
And we're usually nonprofits, and they're billion-dollar banks. So the resource levels are different there.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add and I'm gonna attempt to tie it back to your question, Shania. One of the things that really struck me by the book was, and what he really argues is that the government was not just complicit, but really was a driver of racial segregation. And that there's a certain myth that racial segregation is kind of a natural thing that occurred or based off of individuals' biases, but there were specific programs in terms of how, so a couple examples they give where the government decided to build public housing and that those projects were segregated projects and that they looked at racial composition and put in place laws and policies that entrench segregation, and not just a neutral segregation, but there's kind of like two forces they talked about. One was, and this is around zoning, one was to protect white neighborhoods from being degraded in value from African American people or Black people moving into those neighborhoods, and two, the environmentally damaging industries and pollution, incinerators, garbage dumps, those sites, putting those in Black communities. So that's kind of like the two prong, and also and basically the creation of like what they call in the book ghettos, which is like he defines as a specific neighborhood that is in some ways discriminated against, degraded the conditions, and people are forced to live there, is kind of his definition of what a ghetto is. And that basically it was those conditions, and I would say I would trace it back even further. A couple of us have been reading a book called Born in Blackness, which talks about really the foundation of Africa in the creation of the modern world, and particularly African labor that was extracted through the slave trade, and the creation really of a racial caste system that was the foundation of the United States and the modern economy. Whereas Europe was a kind of backwater sort of like minor power in the world before that kind of drove industrialization and the creation of the modern economy. And I would say that the housing discrimination and racial discrimination is just an extension of that caste system. And now it's created this, what we see as this giant wealth inequality and inequality of environmental conditions and housing conditions. And that it's not accidental, that it actually is based off of, and we might not like consciously like know, even the folks who like are complicit in it might not consciously understand the connection, but it is still connected to that past system that still exists.
Well, and I would just say that, like, you said something earlier that made me think about, white flight, and like the creation of the suburbs, and how that is supported through like the creation of like highways, which are like intentionally like designed and like placed to like the neighborhood I grew up in, like years before I was born, of course, was actually cut in half by like I-65. And like we don't really think about that because those are things that we just take for granted as like given in society. Like, oh yeah, of course, a city has highways and suburbs. That's what cities are, but and so most people don't really blink when the city starts building new overpasses and stack exchanges, to help people get out of the city and like faster and more efficiently, and make commuting easier for people to just come here for work and then go off to wherever they live. But it really doesn't have to be that way. And the fact that it is that way is like it's an intentional choice by someone.
I think it's more piggyback on Alvin, that racial caste. That's the foundation. The racial caste is actually the morals. So your morals are being socialized generation after generation. So it just carries on those beliefs that, okay, we need to be separate, or this place needs to be better than that place, because that's what we see. Like you said, you would think that, okay, there's a highway, we need to get around. So we won't think that this is a bad thing, that this highway is going right past my front door, or that I had to lose my house because they put in this new highway. And they're doing the Rethink 65. I don't know if you guys know anything, but okay. So it just keep going on and on until you understand those concepts of, okay, this is discriminating against a particular group. And what struck me so blatant about the book is that it was obvious. They specifically said Blacks are to be here, whites are to be here. to keep us in, it's just so weird that in 1923, after the Civil War, that was still going on. So it just, that's what struck me odd about that book.
I would add only that I'm like totally utilizing this chat thing here. I'm gonna put a link to an interview that my colleague at work did with somebody who wrote a book about gentrification and the way that kind of capitalism plays into that. I mean, I think that that's something that incorporates sort of what everyone is talking about. But it's talking about the way that housing now is being treated as like a financial commodity, like a bank account, or savings account, more so than a place for people to live. And the impact that has on communities all over the world. And it's like, I feel like until we get a grip on that practice, and it does incorporate people's morals, it incorporates racism, it incorporates all kinds of things. But until we get a grip on that practice of using housing as a way to make money, I think we're gonna keep seeing these issues. I'll put a link in the chat.
What book is it?
Capital City, let's see, Capital City Gentrification, the Real Estate State. Is that familiar?
Mm-mm.
Amy, that's like a very good point about like, the idea of housing as capital, because then it's like, you have to think about like, it's like the question of who has the right to defend their property, essentially, and if that isn't determined by, because like historically, you have the right to defend the place that you live and say that it's yours because you live there, but if that's not enough anymore, if just living there isn't enough, then like, I think the real question becomes like, then who gets to say like, who has the right to be anywhere, and what it ultimately comes down to is the way that we conceptualize ownership. And that being tied to your monetary like power or whatever, the amount of money in the bank. And it's just like, I think that, and maybe like we can like start pivoting the conversation a little bit more towards like solutions. But I think that like ultimately, as long as our idea of ownership is rooted in like, like this idea of like capital, these ideas of like, that you can like present your deed, like, that is like defended by the government, like, I think that we will ultimately be come back to the same place, and maybe not vocalizing, like express, like wording that well, but.
That's a super interesting point. I think it just made me think about in the book. I appreciated the case studies about that the book offered in general, but about East Palo Alto in particular, which is a really highly impacted, mostly people of color area, really close to Stanford's campus, or really close to Stanford in general. But it talked about like when Black people moved to East Palo Alto, there wasn't a lot of housing, and so I think it said that landlords were converting like single family homes to duplexes and things like that, but how those homes weren't meant to handle that many people, right? So it was meant to handle 3 people, not 6 people. And so houses just started kind of breaking down, plumbing, electrical, like it just wasn't meant to sustain that level of use. And I just think about, it just reminds me like the white landlord, Black tenant dynamic is just like another way that white people are deputized in everyday life to enact racialized violence.
Yes.
And I'm sometimes we don't think about violence as maybe this group does, but I feel like the popular description of violence isn't thought of as like as poor housing conditions, right? But like that has an effect on your lifespan. The water you drink, the air you breathe. If there's mold in your walls, there's asbestos in your walls, right? Like that affects your life and your health. Like somebody might as well be punching you. But we don't. I don't know if there's not like a discourse about like how that's actually violence, but because it comes across as a more passive form of it.
And
Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, like, you know, this idea of white landlords being deputized by the government to enact like race-based violence, it doesn't stop at landlords, you know, like even in the first chapter, they talk about the United Services Organization, which, it's like a social club, that was essential, that like had, which president was it? Like, like Roosevelt was like on its board. And so like, it's, this is supposed to be like a private organization. And yet it is enabled both like just be like by like the social circles of its membership, and then like the political support of the government to like participate in the practice of like uh replicating these like unfair housing practices. And so it's like, I think that sometimes when we look at where these problems are coming from, we focus on the government, we focus on the banks, but it really is like a system, like it's a systemic issue, obviously, but like what that means is that like it is being replicated at every level, and so the only way to address it is by having ways to address it at every level.
Yeah, and I would add to that, including what he shared about the white landlord piece, like, and the idea that it is systemic. So I think when we read Evicted, like you can see that even with black landlords, that same white supremacy was replicated.
Mhm.
And it was the white banks, predominantly white banks, that might also have black people working in them and benefiting some limited elite class. But at the same time, it's in some ways it's a white supremacist system that can be enacted by both black or white people.
Yeah.
And it's something that's perpetuated by our status quo and kind of the reality that's been created. But I did have a question related to Chin asking about moving to solutions or ideas. I think what the author argues is that this book is an argument saying that racial segregation and inequality was really driven by the government, and thus the government, both local and national, should take responsibility not for discontinuing discrimination, but for rectifying some of the serious consequences that have been created by their specific policies. So I guess I don't know if you all have any ideas what that could look like.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking about like Evansville. Oh, sorry, I interrupted.
Nope, you
Oh,
go.
I'm just saying, it'll be years down the line. It has to be eroded from the system. New behaviors and learned behaviors is what's gonna get us back to a
All right, sorry, go ahead.
So it's gonna be years out. I mean, there's answers and solutions, but until those learned behaviors are, I guess, erased or obsolete, it'll still be there.
Well, and we're glossing over the fact that there are legislators and people in control in this country who don't want that. And we don't think that's hidden from anybody based on,
They
just
just
a couple of years
refuse.
ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, look at what's happening in like Florida. I mean, Indiana's, we all know what's happening in Indiana, but Florida, like, they're not even trying to hide it. They just are still to this day don't believe that this is an issue or that they should do anything about it. And that's going to take a lot of voters coming to the table and being like, we're done with this. We need to vote new people in. And diversify our legislators socially, racially, ethnically, everything. I mean, here in Indiana, we have, I mean, look at our legislators, our local legislators. You know, a lot of them are landlords, a lot of them are white, most of them are white, most of them are socially, you know, middle to upper class. We need to diversify all of those different components and get to a point where everybody understands that we have to do something about this. Right now, people don't believe that. There are people who are running this country who don't believe that. And we're not going to make it very far until we get people at that table who are louder and have the majority to accept that they need to do something.
I do think that, like, you know, I think that, like, there is like a real challenge with like the legislative approach, I guess, just in that, like, in a lot of ways, like, the system is like structured to work against us, you know, like, even like just aside from like taking into account like gerrymandering, you know, the way that a lot of the time, like, the effectiveness of your campaign is determined by like how much money you have to begin with, you know, like, the simple fact, like, sometimes the people that like sometimes the people that want fair housing, the people that want, like, you know, that equality will be outnumbered, you know, and voting won't be enough to stop that. And I don't think that it's enough to just say, you know, well, they were outvoted, and so they have to deal with it, you know? And so I think that, like, there is like a much larger question about like the deeper structural changes that need to happen to ensure that, like, people's access to housing doesn't come down to, you know, what legislator happens to be in office at any given time, because that can change quick, you know. And housing is too important, I think, to leave it up to, you know, the fickleness of the American political institution.
I think that speaks
They
to something
create the
that
law.
Miss
They're the ones
LaShonda
creating
was
laws.
saying. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that the political institution are the ones who create the laws. So we have to depend on that system to a degree. But we have to change that political system, make it more diverse. The ones that's there now, they don't care about the fair house. They think that everything is okay. But as we, you know, vote and maybe become more diverse, we can probably still begin to see some changes.
I think everybody's right. I think it's like a multi-pronged kind of solution, right? Like, so often positive change doesn't happen until there's no other option for legislators, right? And so I think it takes people mobilizing in their own communities, saying, here's a solution, right? Like, you can't say there's not a solution. We have it right here for you. You just have to put it in black and white. It won't make the thing. But it has to come to the point where there's no other option but for them to make the institutionalize a solution. But I mean, I do think there has to be a larger paradigm shift as well, right? So, like, why do we have to keep proposing to our lawmakers, right, who should already have the solutions in mind, right, who like are the purported experts, right? Like, why should we have to propose those solutions to them? And so I don't know, there has to be a kind of multi-pronged paradigm shift about like us being able to hold people accountable and our lawmakers accountable, but also not needing them in the long run. But I don't know, I think about the Homestead Act, which was in the 1800s and just essentially gave like it created the white middle class in the Midwest, essentially, by giving out farmland plots to white farm workers. Um, Zero to low interest, debts were forgiven really easily. But it's frustrating because there seems like there's an understanding that there can't be a 21st century Homestead Act, right? Like that same thing can't happen now, right? So um, again, the white middle class in Indiana was made via the Homestead Act. There could be an act that does the same thing for the black middle class, right? Or I don't know. I think I'm being less and less coherent as time goes on, but I don't know. I think the solutions are there. I think it's about the political will to actualize them.
I think it's also maybe about perspective change as well, maybe getting to the point where a majority of people do believe that housing is a human right, and therefore a person's access to housing should be more important to stable, standardized housing or stable, safe housing, excuse me, is more important than somebody else's right to make profit off of those things, kind of like what Amy was stating earlier. And I just, that's going to be a hard fought battle. There are so many people who think that once they have their first house, they can take equity out, buy another one, and have like a little side project going, right, with some disposable income. And I don't know if they step back to think about the cause that that has for, our first time home buyers and people who are just trying to make it to their first home. It would almost be good. I think I saw this a meme on Facebook where it's like you have a buffet of food, right? And everybody gets their first serving first, and then people go back for seconds, and then they're like, okay, let's do this, but for housing. I'm like, wow, what a novel approach. That would be so amazing. But as soon as you get those business minded people in there in that discussion, and especially in the state of Indiana, we're a business friendly state. Um, I just, after this IGA, I just have very little hope right now, but I will revamp and come back and hopefully have more energy towards it. But
Amy, were you gonna
a tough.
Amy, were you gonna say something earlier?
I was just gonna really dorkily bring it back to a reproductive justice issue. I'm a reproductive justice dork. Because I think that Miss LaShonda made an excellent point about morals at the beginning of this. And I mean, if you keep pulling the thread on this thing, that's where it goes back to. It goes back to like, what are we telling our children is important? And that has to do with education. And so then we need to look at schools, like there's a lot of moral framework that happens in our schools and this kind of thing. And I think that people with values that probably don't align with ours in this room have figured that out, and they are really aggressively trying to get control of our schools and the moral framework that's being developed there. And that's not unrelated, to housing. When we're raising up the next generation with certain values, to say, it's okay for me to go back to the buffet before everyone else has, this does have to do with that kind of, moral framework that we're creating in the next generations.
I love that you brought that. Oh, I'm sorry if I interrupted you, Amy. No, I'm so thankful for you and Mr. Shonda for bringing in morals, because I think it is important. I mean, again, so like, people go to school based on where they live, right? Based on their housing. If thinking about book bans and like where the will probably be the like future ruling class lives, right? Like they're being isolated from worldviews that oppose white supremacy, right? Or that the antithesis to white supremacy. And if that's the case, then like, what does that mean for 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when they're the lawmakers, right? I also think, um, how do I say this? They're just given like current like demographic trends, right? Like we're going to be majority people of color nation, by the time my kids are adults, right? If we don't shift kind of the economic paradigm, right, then that'll mean that the vast majority of people in our country are going to be poor, right? And what does that mean for the health like of this country, if that many people are poor, right? Ruling classes will always be ruling classes. But I think there needs to be something to said about like the health of the country. And I don't know if that's maybe a tactic that can be used, right, to help galvanize kind of white moderates to move a little bit more left, right, and to not be so moderate on like housing discrimination. But there needs to be some type of like urgency pumped into it, right? Like, because I do think that white moderates kind of have trouble understanding issues that don't affect them personally, right? But if we say, you know, our country is going to have a problem like that'll affect everyone in 20 years if we don't get to this right now, that could be something. I mean, I don't know. We also, that's been the rhetoric on climate change for the past 20 years, and it hasn't really affected much. So maybe not. Maybe I have too much faith in white moderates, but I don't know.
In kind of just like, you know, what I've seen, you know, and especially like, I think that the work that Kheprw does is really centered around shifting that balance of power, you know, like it is one side of the battle to try to convince the people who have control of the housing that they should distribute it more equitably. But, you know, it's also important, I think, to be taking some of the housing back directly as well, you know, because at the end of the day, we can't just be done if they say no, you know. Um, uh, and if they would, and I think it's kind of like what Erica was talking about earlier, like, you know, some legislators just don't want to see it happen, you know, that shouldn't stop the fight. And that shouldn't, and our success shouldn't necessarily, I think, hinge on like the approval of like, you know, a relatively small number of individuals. And I think that like, you know, so I really look at like the community land trust model, for example, housing co-ops, for example, anything that like involves like, you know, those grassroots groups that form organically to function democratically, organizing like their collective power to improve their collective access to resources. You know, and I think that's what the solution is going to look like going forward. It's going to be smaller communities organizing, you know, to win like more local battles that will like, you know, compound and spread and, you know, because like enough local battles as a state, you know, you've won the whole state after a certain point, if you win the battle in enough places. So
The problem with Indiana is we've got to start winning them in the rural places too.
true.
Our cities have been trying to do some great stuff for affordable housing and housing issues, and our state continues to preempt them.
Yeah.
Our website has a whole public policy page that has bad Indiana General Assembly bills as far as housing goes, and they usually are directly related to something that a city has done, where they're trying to protect renters or they're trying to do this or that, and then the state was like, no, we don't want you doing that.
Mhm. I
So
think,
we've got to get those rural communities on board.
and I think that also, you know, because like it's all connected, right? So I think that also like raises like a question about the intersection between like housing access and food access, right? Um, uh, because it's like these cities are the most densely populated, you know, and yet food is the most inaccessible, like, you know, in like some of these like urban areas, you know.
Mhm.
And like I think like we've talked a lot about how these different like parts of society are like manufactured. Well, you know, why does our urban life and our rural life need to be so starkly separated? You know, why can't there be a closer relationship between the urban communities and the rural communities, you know, which would allow them both to, you know, sort of like mobilize together and like help meet each other's needs, you know? And so I think that you're definitely right, Erica, like looking to the rural communities, building connections out
Well, and there
there.
also needs to be this perspective. Oh, sorry. I
No,
think
no,
my
no.
internet is slow.
What?
There also needs to be
Yeah.
this perspective that just because an issue isn't a problem in your community, that you just don't care about it.
Mhm.
Like, where does morality come in there? Like, why can't we care about our neighbors and care about what's going on in the cities as much as we care about what's going on in our community, or vice versa? I don't know. I doubt it's a new perspective, but it's not a perspective that I want legislators having. Like, our country, every person in it should have access to housing. And I'm talking safe, affordable housing. And I don't know, I want legislators in office that agree with that for everybody, not just rural communities, not just urban communities, not just suburbs, everybody. And I don't know where perspective came, where, well, it's not an issue in my district, so I'm not gonna support that came from, but I'm tired of hearing it, to be honest.
I think I'll say this real quick and then maybe we can start wrapping it up. I think it kind of goes back to what he said earlier about the need for this like massive paradigm shift. And it goes back to what Amy said earlier about like the tie-in between like reproductive rights, like what's going on in like the schools, what's going on at home, what's going on online, like we said earlier, like all of this stuff is connected. So like that concern for our neighbors and communities outside of our own, it's a cultural thing, because it's like, it's not just like an inherent human nature, like to only care about like the people in your immediate surroundings. That's a cultural belief. And when we talk about like where culture comes from, it comes from movies, it comes from music, it comes from politics, the debates that we see on our TVs, it comes from like all of these things that we are absorbing and like putting back out on a daily basis. And so I think that like that is why the multifaceted, multi-pronged approach is so important, because like, these are societal issues, meaning that they don't come from just like one particular place, they are like, but they're free flowing and they're constantly changing and they're constantly being like influenced and manipulated. It just depends on what you're putting in front of people. And I guess like the fact that some people have a way greater ability to, shape culture through music and movies and books and politics and all that stuff. So.
Well, it's almost like a vicious cycle too. Like, we've segregated everybody, so now people can't relate to people who don't look like them, or they can't relate to people who make less or more money than them. Like, our suburbs are completely, sheltered from what's going on here, and that just compounds the problems.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make one little correction. You said reproductive rights, and a lot of times when people say reproductive rights, they think about like the physicality of like health, and especially to do with abortion, but reproductive justice is about like your ability to raise your children, if that's what you so choose, as well. It incorporates kind of everything. So just want to
sure. Thank you. Well, it is one.
Great work, Janelle.
Thanks, Alvin. You too. Thank you, everybody, for contributing, and to everybody watching this recording in the future. I will see you all next month.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.